In the city of Chicago, on a gray autumn morning, when the drizzle refused to stop and the wind carried the smell of wet asphalt through the glass towers downtown, a man named Declan Mercer walked into the headquarters of Helix Dynamics, carrying nothing but a worn leather folder and 3 years of silence. He was 41 years old, quiet in the way that made people forget he was even in the room, and for 3 years he had worked harder than almost anyone at the company without a single promotion to show for it. When the position of regional executive director opened that autumn, every manager on the floor assumed his name would be called. Nobody in that building knew that Declan Mercer was not simply an employee. Nobody knew he held 22% of the company through a family trust that had never once been disclosed to the woman who ran the place. And nobody, least of all the woman standing at the front of that conference room 3 days later, understood that by dismissing him in front of hundreds of employees, she was about to declare war on the very foundation she stood on. She smiled with a coldness that filled the silence of the room and said the words that would end her career before she even understood she had spoken them. Declan simply closed his notebook, rose from his seat, and answered so calmly that half the room thought they had misheard him. 3 years earlier, Helix Dynamics had been a company circling the drain, its defense contracts unraveling one after another, its stock quietly bleeding out, while executives pretended the numbers would fix themselves. It was the Mercer family trust that had stepped in during those final desperate weeks, wiring the capital that kept the lights on and the payroll running. And it was Declan himself who had insisted on one single condition before he allowed a cent of that money to move. He did not want a title. He did not want a corner office or a seat at the head of the table. He wanted anonymity, a chance to walk the floors of his own company as an ordinary man, to watch how people behaved when they believed nobody with real power was watching. So he took the modest role of process manager, buried himself in spreadsheets and workflow charts, and let the world believe he was simply another employee grinding through the years. For 3 years he watched everything. He watched the way departments talked to each other, the way credit was claimed and blame was distributed, the way certain names rose through the ranks not because of what they built, but because of who they flattered. And through all of it, he said almost nothing. By the time the regional director position opened, Declan's fingerprints were on nearly every success the company had posted that year. He had personally restructured the supply chain in a way that saved the company tens of millions of dollars. He had walked into 3 separate projects that were on the verge of collapse and pulled each one back from the edge through sheer methodical patience. He had rebuilt entire workflows from the ground up, cutting waste that senior executives had ignored for a decade because it was easier to blame the market than to look inward. His colleagues respected him in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the quiet trust that grows when someone consistently does what they say they will do. Even members of the executive board, men and women who rarely praised anyone below the vice president level, had mentioned his name in private conversations as the obvious choice for the new role. There was only one person in the building who had never warmed to him. And unfortunately for Declan, she happened to be the one signing off on every promotion in the company. Vivian Sterling was 38 years old, sharp as a blade and twice as unforgiving, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of Helix Dynamics through a combination of genuine intelligence and an appetite for control that bordered on obsession. She was undeniably brilliant, capable of dismantling a competitor's strategy in a single meeting. And her decisiveness had earned her a reputation as someone who never hesitated, never second-guessed, never admitted a mistake in front of an audience. But somewhere along the way, that decisiveness had curdled into something closer to arrogance, a belief that her authority was not just earned but absolute, unquestionable, permanent. She had never met the silent shareholders behind the Mercer Trust. She did not know their names, had never seen a face attached to the 22% stake that technically gave someone else a claim over her own fate. And she had certainly never imagined that the quiet, unassuming man from process management, the one who barely spoke in meetings and never once pushed back on her decisions, could be anything more than exactly what he appeared to be. Vivian had never liked Declan. Not really. Though she would have struggled to explain precisely why, if anyone had asked. He was too quiet for her taste, too willing to let his work speak instead of angling for visibility the way everyone else in the building did. He did not play the political games that she considered essential to leadership. He did not linger after meetings to align himself with the right people, did not send the carefully worded emails designed to make his contributions visible to the people who mattered. In Vivian's mind, a leader needed to command a room, needed to be seen, needed above all to follow direction without friction, and Declan Mercer, for all his competence, had never once struck her as a man who would simply do as he was told. So when the announcement went out to the entire company that the regional director position was open, and the internal rumor mill immediately settled on his name as the presumptive winner, Vivian Sterling had already made up her mind that it would not be him. The company-wide meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and the largest conference room at Helix Dynamics filled to capacity long before Vivian arrived. Employees from every department crowded along the walls when the chairs ran out, phones tucked away, eyes fixed toward the small stage where the announcement would be made. There was a current of quiet anticipation running through the room, the kind that comes when people believe, almost universally, that they already know the outcome and are simply waiting for the formality to catch up to reality. Declan sat near the back, unremarkable as always, a notebook open on his knee and a pen resting loosely in his hand, giving no outward sign that he understood what was about to happen to him. Vivian stepped up to the small podium in a charcoal suit that fit her like armor, scanned the room with the practiced composure of someone who had delivered 1,000 announcements before, and began to speak. She thanked the room for their patience during the restructuring process, thanked the finance team for their diligence, thanked the operations department for holding the line during a difficult quarter, and then, without any real change in her tone, she announced the name of the new regional director. It was not Declan Mercer. It was Brandon Cross, a man who had worked under Declan for less than 2 years, whose experience in the field was thin compared to almost anyone else being considered, but whose relationship with Vivian was, by that point, an open secret among the senior staff. A ripple moved through the room, the kind of silence that is louder than any gasp. Heads turning instinctively toward the back, where Declan sat. Vivian, sensing the disbelief settling over the crowd, decided to explain herself. And, in doing so, she made the single greatest miscalculation of her career. She said that leadership was not simply a matter of competence, that a true leader needed to understand something deeper, something more important than raw ability. Her eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the back row where Declan sat unmoving, and she let the moment stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly who she was addressing. What mattered most, she said, was knowing one's place. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of stillness that makes the hum of air conditioning sound deafening. Declan did not flinch, did not lower his eyes, did not offer the small performance of humiliation that Vivian had perhaps expected. Instead, he simply smiled, a small, private smile that unsettled the handful of people close enough to see it clearly, and he rose slowly from his chair. "If that is the final decision," he said, his voice calm and unhurried, carrying easily through a room that had gone utterly quiet, "then perhaps it is time you prepared for your own final decision." Vivian laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to dismiss the strangeness of the moment, and a few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd in response. Though nobody quite understood what had just been said, or why it had been said, with such quiet certainty. Declan gathered his notebook, nodded once toward the stage, and walked out of the conference room without another word, leaving behind a silence that would linger in that building for far longer than anyone in it could have predicted. Vivian watched him go, irritation flickering across her face, already composing the story she would tell herself about a disappointed man overreacting to a decision that was, in her mind, entirely justified. Before he had ever set foot inside Helix Dynamics, Declan had spent nearly a decade designing artificial intelligence systems for military logistics, work that demanded a mind capable of tracking 1,000 variables at once, while never losing sight of the single mistake that could cost someone their life. He had walked away from that career quietly, without scandal or controversy, choosing instead a simpler existence after his marriage ended, and he found himself, for the first time in years, living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. Colleagues who had known him during those earlier years still spoke of him with a kind of reverence that never quite matched the low profile he kept at Helix Dynamics, describing a man who could dismantle a flawed system in an afternoon and rebuild it into something sturdier without ever raising his voice. It was that same instinct, the discipline of a man who had once designed systems meant to survive under pressure, that he carried into his years of quiet observation inside the company his family had rescued. Nobody at Helix Dynamics knew any of this history, because Declan had never once mentioned it, content to let his coworkers assume he was simply a capable, unremarkable manager who happened to be good at his job. He ate lunch alone most days, reviewing reports at his desk instead of joining the informal cliques that had formed around the office kitchen, and the handful of people who tried to draw him into casual conversation usually came away with the impression of a man who listened far more than he spoke. That reputation for silence, for a certain measured distance from the social machinery of the office, was precisely what Vivian had used against him in her private assessments of his character. She had mistaken his discipline for a lack of ambition, his patience for a lack of vision, never once considering that the very qualities she dismissed were the same ones that had allowed him to quietly save her company from collapse 3 years earlier, without asking for a single word of credit in return. 2 days later, Declan requested a leave of absence, citing personal matters that he declined to elaborate on, and Human Resources approved it without much scrutiny given his years of unblemished service. Vivian barely registered the news beyond a passing comment to her assistant, certain that he was simply sulking, licking his wounds somewhere away from the office before eventually returning, chastened and compliant, ready to accept his place in the new hierarchy. Brandon Cross stepped into the regional director role with visible enthusiasm, eager to prove himself worthy of the trust Vivian had placed in him, but within days it became apparent that enthusiasm alone was not going to be enough. The processes that Declan had spent years refining began to fracture almost immediately in his absence, revealing just how much of the department's stability had depended on a single quiet man nobody had thought to properly credit. Client complaints started arriving within the first week, small at first, minor scheduling conflicts and miscommunications that anyone might attribute to a transition period. But the small problems multiplied quickly into larger ones, projects that had been running smoothly for months, suddenly stalling over logistical errors that Declan would have caught and corrected before they ever reached a client's desk. Technical failures crept into systems that had operated flawlessly under his oversight, the kind of subtle errors that accumulate when the person who built the safety nets is no longer there to check them. Brandon, overwhelmed and increasingly desperate, began making decisions under pressure that only compounded the chaos, and department heads, who had once respected the chain of command, started quietly bypassing him to reach out to colleagues who had worked directly with Declan, hoping someone, an order, could explain what exactly had gone so wrong so fast. A major client in the aerospace division, one whose contract had been personally negotiated by Declan 2 years earlier, sent a formal letter of concern after a shipment of critical components arrived nearly 3 weeks behind schedule, an error that would have been unthinkable under the old tracking system Declan had built and maintained without complaint for years. Brandon, desperate to prove himself capable, began overriding safeguards that had been designed specifically to catch this kind of failure before it ever reached a client's desk, convinced that speed alone would compensate for the gaps in his experience. Instead, the overrides introduced new errors on top of the old ones, and within a month, 2 of the department's longest-standing clients had quietly begun requesting meetings with other regional offices, a signal that seasoned account managers recognized immediately as the first sign of an account preparing to walk away entirely. Whispers began moving through the hallways, employees comparing notes in hushed voices near the elevators, wondering aloud whether the company had made a catastrophic mistake in choosing Brandon over the man who had quietly kept the entire operation running for years. Vivian, watching the reports pile up on her desk, allowed herself to believe, for a while, that this was simply the natural friction of any leadership transition, a temporary dip that would smooth itself out once Brandon found his footing. She told herself the timing was coincidental, that a man like Declan Mercer, quiet and unassuming as he had always been, could not possibly be the reason her company was suddenly hemorrhaging efficiency on every front. It was easier, in those first few weeks, to believe in coincidence than to consider the alternative, that perhaps she had removed the one load-bearing wall in a structure that had never actually needed her as much as she assumed. But belief, however comfortable, has a way of collapsing under the weight of evidence, and evidence was exactly what arrived on her desk, one gray morning, in the form of a formal notice she had never seen before in all her years running the company. The letter was brief, precise, and utterly without warmth, informing Vivian Sterling that a special meeting of the board of directors had been called, and that her attendance was mandatory rather than optional. She read it twice, confused by the formality of the language, and reached out to her assistant to ask who exactly had authorized such a meeting, since as far as she understood, she alone held that authority within the company's governance structure. The answer that came back unsettled her, in a way she could not quite name. There was, apparently, a shareholder listed in the company's founding trust documents whose identity had never been disclosed to her, someone who held enough equity to legally compel a board meeting whenever they deemed it necessary. Vivian had built her entire tenure at Helix Dynamics on the assumption that her authority was total, that no one above her existed to question her decisions. And for the first time in years, a small, cold thread of doubt began to work its way through that certainty. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the same gray drizzle that seemed to follow this entire story through the streets of Chicago. And Vivian walked into the executive boardroom dressed in her sharpest suit, determined to project the same unshakable confidence she brought to every meeting she had ever led. The long table was already filling with familiar faces, senior board members she had worked alongside for years, along with a handful of representatives from the founding trust, whose names she recognized, but whose faces she had rarely, if ever, seen in person. She took her seat at the head of the table, as she always did, folder open, agenda prepared, fully expecting to control the room the way she controlled every room she entered. It was only when the final chair at the far end of the table pulled back that something in her composure began to crack. Declan Mercer walked in wearing the same understated gray jacket he wore to the office every day, carrying the same worn leather folder he had carried into the company-wide meeting weeks earlier, and as he crossed the threshold of the boardroom, something extraordinary happened that Vivian would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Every single person seated at that table rose to their feet, not out of habit, not out of politeness, but with the unmistakable weight of genuine deference, the kind reserved for someone whose presence fundamentally changed the balance of power in the room. One of the senior board members, a man Vivian had known for nearly a decade and had never once seen show that level of respect to anyone, extended his hand and addressed Declan by name with a formality that made her stomach twist. "Mr. Mercer," he said. And the two simple words landed in the room like a verdict already decided. Vivian sat frozen, her mind scrambling to reconcile the man she had dismissed weeks earlier in front of the entire company with the figure now commanding the silent respect of everyone around that table. She did not understand what she was witnessing, could not process why a mid-level process manager, a man she had publicly humiliated without a second thought, was being treated like the most important person in the room. The chairman of the board rose next, clearing his throat before addressing the group with the calm authority of someone delivering news he had known for a very long time but had been sworn to keep quiet. The company's largest shareholder, he announced, had finally decided it was time to make his presence known. And as those words settled over the room, Vivian felt the ground shift beneath her in a way she had never experienced in her entire career. What followed was a story that unraveled slowly, deliberately, as the chairman laid out a history that Vivian had never been permitted to know. 3 years earlier, when Helix Dynamics stood on the edge of financial collapse, it was the Mercer family trust, quietly and without fanfare, that had provided the capital injection necessary to keep the company alive. Declan himself had structured the arrangement, and in doing so, had made a single unusual demand that the board had honored ever since. He did not want control. He did not want his name attached to any title of authority. He wanted only the freedom to walk among the employees of the company he now partly owned as an ordinary man, unrecognized, unremarkable, free to observe the true character of the organization without the distortion that power inevitably creates in how people behave around it. For 3 years, he had done exactly that. watching quietly from a desk in process management, learning the company from the inside out in a way no executive ever truly could. He had watched talented employees get passed over for promotions in favor of people who simply knew how to flatter the right person at the right moment. He had watched credit for good ideas get quietly reassigned up the chain of command, watched genuine effort go unrewarded while performative loyalty was mistaken for competence. He had said nothing through all of it, not because he did not notice, but because he wanted to see how deep the pattern ran before he ever considered stepping in. In quiet moments during those 3 years, Declan kept a private record of what he observed. Small notes in the same worn leather folder he carried everywhere, dates and names and details that meant nothing to anyone who might glance at them, but that formed, over time, a meticulous map of exactly how power moved through the company when nobody with real authority was thought to be watching. He noted the engineer who had been quietly pushed out after refusing to falsify a safety report, and the young analyst who had been passed over for promotion 3 years running despite consistently outperforming her peers, simply because she had once challenged an executive's assumption in a meeting and never been fully forgiven for it. He noted, too, the smaller kindnesses, the managers who mentored without seeking recognition, the employees who covered for a struggling coworker without ever mentioning it to a supervisor, the quiet decency that existed alongside the dysfunction and gave him hope that the culture could still be repaired rather than simply condemned. It was this same folder, thickened over 3 years into something closer to an archive, that he eventually handed over to the auditors once the board approved his request for an independent review. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, in a crowded conference room, he had watched Vivian Sterling stand in front of hundreds of employees and dismiss him not for any failure of performance, but for the simple crime of not knowing his place. It was, the chairman noted quietly, the exact moment Declan had decided that observation alone was no longer enough. Declan requested that the board authorize an independent audit of leadership practices across the company, a review conducted by an outside firm with no ties to current management and full authority to examine hiring decisions, performance evaluations, and promotion patterns over the previous 2 years. The board approved the request without hesitation, and the audit, once it began, did not take long to surface a pattern that was difficult to explain away as coincidence. It found that Vivian had systematically placed personal loyalists into key positions regardless of qualification, that established procedures for evaluating talent had been quietly bypassed whenever the outcome threatened someone she favored, that performance reviews had, on multiple documented occasions, been altered or reframed to justify decisions that had already been made for entirely different reasons. There was no evidence of financial theft, no embezzlement, nothing that would constitute outright criminal fraud. What the audit found instead was something harder to prosecute, but, in the eyes of the board, no less damaging, a pattern of quiet, persistent abuse of power, dressed up in the language of leadership judgment. The auditors interviewed dozens of current and former employees over the course of that review, many of whom had never spoken openly about their experiences for fear of retaliation, and the transcripts that emerged painted a picture far more troubling than the board had initially expected. One former project lead described being quietly reassigned to a dead-end division after raising concerns about a budget decision that Vivian had personally championed. Her career effectively stalled for 2 years before she eventually left the company altogether. Another employee, a young woman who had once been considered among the most promising analysts in her department, described sitting through a performance review in which accomplishments she had clearly documented were minimized in favor of vague language about her not yet being ready, language that mirrored almost exactly what Vivian had said publicly about Declan weeks earlier. Taken individually, each story might have been dismissed as an isolated grievance, the kind of complaint that exists in every large organization. Taken together, laid side by side across 2 years of documentation, they formed something the board could no longer explain away as ordinary workplace friction. As the findings circulated among board members in the days that followed, the ground beneath Vivian's position began to shift in ways she could feel but could not yet fully see. She refused, at first, to accept that any of this could threaten her. Certain that her track record of results, Her years of driving growth and closing contracts would outweigh whatever the audit had uncovered. She began working the angles she knew best, the same tools that had carried her to the top in the first place. She tried to paint Declan as a disgruntled employee, exploiting a loophole in the company's ownership structure, a man motivated by resentment rather than principle, someone who had waited years to spring a trap out of bitterness over a single denied promotion. She reached out to contacts in the business press, hoping to shape the narrative before it could shape itself, framing the audit as an internal power struggle rather than a legitimate governance concern. She pressured department heads directly, calling in favors and calling out loyalties, urging them to publicly affirm their confidence in her leadership before the board could finalize any decision. But something had already changed, something Vivian could not manipulate her way around, no matter how skillfully she worked the room. One by one, the senior leaders she called on to support her began, instead, to quietly align themselves with Declan. It was not because of the ownership stake, not because of the 22% that had suddenly given his name so much weight in boardrooms across the company. It was because nearly every one of them remembered a moment, sometimes years earlier, when it had been Declan, working quietly behind the scenes, who had saved their project, corrected their mistake, or shielded them from a failure that would have ended their career. He had never asked for credit in those moments. He had simply done the work and let it speak for him. And now, when it mattered most, that history spoke louder than anything Vivian could offer in exchange for loyalty. One evening, she summoned the head of the marketing division into her office, a woman named Renee Callahan, who had worked closely under her for nearly 6 years. Hoping to secure at least one visible ally before the story could spread any further through the company, Renee listened politely as Vivian outlined her version of events, framing the audit as an act of quiet sabotage from a bitter employee exploiting a legal technicality. But when Vivian finally asked directly for her support, Renee hesitated in a way that told her everything before a single word was spoken. Renee explained, gently but without wavering, that 2 years earlier it had been Declan who quietly caught an error in a campaign budget that would have cost the marketing division nearly $1 million, an error nobody else in the building had noticed until he flagged it anonymously through an internal review channel. She said she could not, in good conscience, stand against a man who had saved her department without ever once asking for recognition, and she left the office that evening, having said no to the woman who had built her entire career on knowing how to make people say yes. It was the first of many such conversations that week, each one ending the same way, each one another quiet confirmation that the loyalty Vivian believed she had spent years building had never truly belonged to her at all. She found herself, for the first time in her professional life, genuinely and completely alone. The final board meeting was scheduled 2 weeks later, and Vivian walked into that room still believing, against every signal the previous weeks had given her, that she would emerge from it with her position intact. She had spent those 2 weeks rehearsing her defense, preparing statistics on revenue growth and market share, convinced that numbers alone could shield her from the consequences of how she had treated the people beneath her. The chairman opened the meeting with a formal reading of the audit's conclusions, followed by statements from 3 separate board members who had once been counted among her strongest allies, each of them describing, in careful and deliberate language, a pattern of leadership that had grown increasingly disconnected from the people it was meant to serve. When the floor finally opened for a vote, Vivian sat perfectly still, jaw set, still telling herself that reason would prevail. The vote came back decisively against her. A clear majority of the board called for her immediate removal as chief executive officer, citing the findings of the audit and the erosion of trust among senior leadership as sufficient grounds for the decision. Vivian sat in stunned silence as the chairman read the final tally aloud, the number settling over her like a verdict she had somehow never allowed herself to consider possible. She turned, almost involuntarily, to look at Declan seated at the far end of the table, searching his face for some flicker of triumph, some quiet satisfaction at having brought down the woman who had humiliated him in front of the entire company. She found none. His expression remained exactly as it had been throughout the entire meeting, calm, unreadable, entirely without malice. "I never wanted your chair," he said simply, his voice carrying none of the vindication she had braced herself for. He slid a folder across the table toward the chairman, containing the name of a candidate the board would ultimately approve to take over as the company's next chief executive officer. It was not Declan's own name written on that document. It was the name of the company's longtime chief operating officer, a woman who had spent nearly a decade building relationships across every department, known throughout the company for a management style built on patience and genuine collaboration rather than fear or favoritism. Vivian stared at the folder, then at Declan, struggling to understand a man who had just dismantled her career and yet clearly had no interest in claiming the throne he could easily have taken for himself. Weeks later, after the transition had been formally announced and the initial shock had begun to settle into the quieter rhythms of a company adjusting to new leadership, Vivian requested one final conversation with Declan before she left the building for good. They met in a small conference room on an upper floor. The same rain that had followed this entire story tapping softly against the windows. And for the first time since the two of them had crossed paths years earlier, there was no audience, no title, no power imbalance left to perform for. She asked him the question that had haunted her since the moment the vote was read aloud, the question she had turned over endlessly in the sleepless nights that followed her removal. Why? She asked. Had he never simply taken the position everyone assumed he wanted? Why build the case, endure the years of silence, orchestrate the downfall of a CEO, only to hand the company to someone else entirely? Declan considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet, but entirely without hesitation. He told her that his goal had never been to become a leader himself, but to build an environment where genuine leaders could actually rise, unburdened by the kind of politics and favoritism that had defined the culture under her tenure. He explained that what had hurt him most, in the end, was never the denied promotion itself, never the sting of watching a less experienced man take the role everyone believed was rightfully his. What had genuinely disappointed him was watching someone with real intelligence, real capability, choose again and again to treat the people beneath her as instruments rather than individuals, to mistake obedience for loyalty and silence for weakness. Vivian sat with that answer for a long time, and for the first time in the entire story, something in her posture softened, the practiced armor cracking just enough to let something honest through. She asked him, almost hesitantly, whether he had ever considered simply confronting her privately in those early years, telling her directly what he had observed, instead of letting 3 years pass in silence while he quietly built his case. Declan admitted that he had considered it more than once, especially in the earlier months when the patterns he noticed still seemed correctable, small enough that a private conversation might have shifted things before they hardened into habit. But he explained that every time he came close to speaking up, something in the way she dismissed dissent from others convinced him that a quiet suggestion from an unremarkable process manager would have changed nothing, that she would have needed to see the consequences of her own choices laid bare before she could ever recognize them as choices at all, rather than simply the natural order of things. He told her, without cruelty, that he took no pleasure in being proven right about that. She lowered her head and offered an apology that was not performed for an audience, not calculated to protect her image, but genuinely, quietly hers. A year passed, and the transformation inside Helix Dynamics became difficult to ignore, even for people who had never worked there directly. Under its new leadership, the company posted the strongest growth it had seen in nearly a decade. Contracts expanding across new markets, employee retention climbing to levels the organization had not reached in years. The culture itself had shifted in ways that mattered far more than any single quarterly report, performance evaluations conducted with a transparency that made favoritism far harder to hide, promotions decided by clearly documented criteria rather than proximity to power. Talented employees who had once quietly updated their resumes, convinced there was no future for them under the old regime, began instead to stay, to grow, to take on responsibilities that finally matched their ability. The atmosphere throughout the building had changed from one of quiet anxiety to something closer to genuine trust. Declan Mercer remained exactly where he had always been, working out of the same modest office in operations, still carrying the same worn leather folder into meetings that had nothing to do with his enormous stake in the company. He attended board sessions only when major strategic decisions required his input, choosing deliberately to stay out of the daily machinery of leadership he had helped install. He never took a title beyond the one he had always carried, and colleagues who worked alongside him day to day still, for the most part, had no idea just how much of the company technically belonged to him. Vivian, for her part, had left Helix Dynamics entirely, eventually finding her way into a much smaller consulting role advising a modest regional business on questions of governance and management. Those who worked with her in that new chapter of her career noticed something different about her: a willingness to listen before she spoke, to ask questions instead of issuing directives, a habit that had clearly been forged in the humbling aftermath of everything she had lost. The small business she now advised had barely a dozen employees, a modest logistics firm on the edge of the city with none of the glass and steel grandeur of Helix Dynamics. And yet Vivian found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely present in the meetings she attended, asking about the challenges her clients faced, rather than waiting for her turn to speak. She kept, on her desk in that smaller office, a single printed page from the audit report that had once ended her career, not as a punishment she inflicted on herself, but as a quiet reminder of the version of herself she never wanted to become again. Colleagues who met her for the first time in this new chapter had no idea she had once run a company worth billions of dollars, and she never mentioned it, unless directly asked, having finally come to understand, in the most painful way possible, the very lesson Declan had spent 3 years quietly living by. The transition at Helix Dynamics itself unfolded with a steadiness that surprised even the board members who had voted for it. The new chief executive officer, promoted from her years as chief operating officer, spent her first months traveling between every regional office in person, rather than issuing directives from headquarters, meeting individually with employees who had never once spoken directly to a member of senior leadership. She reinstated the review processes that had quietly eroded under Vivian's tenure, rebuilding transparent criteria for promotion that made favoritism far more difficult to disguise as judgment. Brandon Cross, to his credit, remained with the company in a smaller role better suited to his experience, and within a year he had earned back the respect of colleagues who once doubted him, proving that the failure of his brief promotion had never truly been a failure of character but simply a case of a good employee placed too far, too fast, beyond his readiness. On an ordinary afternoon nearly 18 months after the vote that removed her from power, a young employee newly hired into the operations department found herself sitting across from Declan during a routine training session, still slightly in awe of the quiet man everyone in the building seemed to treat with such unusual respect, despite his unassuming title. She asked him, with the directness that only comes from genuinely not knowing better, why he had never once told anyone he was one of the company's largest shareholders, why he had spent years letting people assume he was simply another employee grinding through an ordinary career. Declan smiled, the same small, private smile that had once unsettled an entire boardroom, and gave her an answer. "If a title is the only reason someone respects you," he said, "then that respect was never worth having in the first place." Outside the windows of Helix Dynamics that afternoon, the Chicago sky had finally cleared after weeks of gray autumn rain, sunlight breaking across the glass towers downtown in a way that seemed, to those who noticed it, like more than simple coincidence. The company that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of arrogance and quiet cruelty had found its way, slowly and deliberately, into something steadier, something built not on fear, but on the kind of respect that cannot be assigned by a title or demanded by a position of authority. It was a respect that had to be earned, one decision at a time, one person treated fairly at a time, and it was a lesson that Vivian Sterling, in the end, had learned in the hardest possible way. Power could be granted by a signature on an org chart, but the loyalty of the people beneath that power could never be bought, borrowed, or commanded. It could only be built, patiently and honestly, by the way a person chose to treat those who had no way of paying them back.